My name is Ethan. Or at least that's what I thought until one meeting that changed everything I knew about myself. Until that day, my life was simple, even boring to be honest. I lived in a small rented house on the outskirts of the city and worked in a warehouse for a large logistics company. Every day was like a carbon copy. I got up at 6:45, poured myself strong black coffee, turned on the radio, listened to the weather forecast, drove to work through the same streets, passed the same gas stations and bakeries, greeted the same people and loaded, unloaded, signed papers, listened to the elevators buzzing and metal rails clank. I returned home, ate, watched TV, and went to bed. I wasn't a loner, but I wasn't looking for company either. I had acquaintances, a couple friends from work, with whom I could go for a beer on Fridays. But in general, I was comfortable alone. I loved silence, order, and routine. The house I rented was old. It was built, apparently, in the middle of the last century. From the outside, it looked like an ordinary building. One floor, a facade of darkened wooden planks, a faded roof. Inside, there are wooden floors, sagging door jambs, and a slight smell of old paper and dust that has soaked into the wallpaper. I liked this atmosphere. There was something reliable and well-established about her. I didn't know who had lived here before me, and I wasn't particularly interested. The house was on the edge of the street, and the nearest neighbor was 50 meters away, a couple of pensioners who hardly went outside. In short, everything was quiet. Until one morning. It was Monday. I remember it clearly because the day before I drank wine alone and watched an old movie, fell asleep late, and woke up later than usual in the morning. It was about 8 o'clock. I rushed into the bathroom, hastily washed my face, combed my hair, and was just walking out the door when I heard someone say my name. It was quiet like a whisper, but clearly, Ethan. I stopped. He looked around. There was a feeling that the voice sounded very close in the room. I even went back to the hallway and checked, but there was no one there. The windows are closed. I thought it was my imagination. Maybe it was on the radio or just a mind game. I turned off the light, got out, and went to work. The next incident occurred in the evening. I was returning home. It was already dark outside. When I got to the house, I noticed that the door wasn't fully closed. I definitely remembered that I had slammed it shut in the morning. The door in my house is heavy. It has a characteristic creak, and in order not to close it, it was necessary to leave it ajar. I entered cautiously. The hallway was dark. I didn't turn on the light, just stood there and listened. Absolute silence. Then slowly, trying not to creak the floor, he walked through the rooms. Everything was in its place. Nothing is missing. I even checked the drawer where I kept some cash. Everything was there. I tried to put it down to forgetfulness again. Maybe it was a messy morning. I just didn't close the door. But I was already worried inside. I started locking the door with 2 locks, and I started looking around more often on the way home. I still felt like someone was watching me. A couple of days later, something strange happened. I found a note under the door. On a piece of paper, torn out as if from an old notebook, it was neatly written. I remember you falling off your bike. You were 7. You had a blue jacket and you were crying a lot. I was standing nearby, but you didn't notice me. I've read it over and over again. I shuddered. I really fell off my bike when I was 7 years old. It was some kind of park or playground. I couldn't remember exactly, but there was a blue jacket. I hurt my knee badly, and then my mom took me home in her arms. Who could have known that? I looked around the street, but there was no one there. No car, no passerby, not even a cat. I held the paper in my hand and felt it tremble. I couldn't figure out if this was a prank. Is someone watching me? I called Rich, a friend from work. He arrived, we had a beer, and I told him about the note. He laughed, of course, and said it was probably one of the locals joking. Maybe someone from old acquaintances recognized me. He didn't pay attention, but I felt like it wasn't just a joke. Someone really knew details from my past that I barely remember myself. The next day, I went to my parents' house. I haven't been to them for a long time. I tried to ask my mom if she remembered the bike incident. She nodded, but couldn't remember any details, except that the jacket was indeed blue. I didn't show the note. He just said that he remembered his childhood. When I got home, I found a new note. She was lying right on the kitchen table. I haven't been home all day. The locks were intact, the window was closed. I didn't understand how she could be here. You always like to hide under the table when you were angry. Even when everyone thought you were gone, you were there. Always there. I was standing in the middle of the kitchen, holding a piece of paper in my hands, and I could feel the floor sinking under my feet. Whoever it was knew me. He didn't just know, but remembered things that no one else knew. Even I wouldn't have remembered it myself if it hadn't been for the note. I actually hid under the table when I was angry. It was at a very young age, when I was 4 or 5. Only Mom remembered that, but she never told anyone about it. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with the light on and a knife in my hand, listening to every rustle. It felt like someone was right outside the door, or under the window, or already inside. That night, for the first time, I seriously thought about moving out. Up to this point, I tried to explain all the disturbing details by logic, by chance forgetfulness, perhaps by someone from the past who for some reason decided to make a joke or play on memories. But the fact that someone broke into my house and left a note on the kitchen table while I was at my parents' place was beyond explicable. I checked the locks, and there were no signs of forced entry. Not on the door, not on the windows. Everything was closed just as I left it. I even went to the neighbors, the pensioners 2 houses down, to ask if they had seen anyone near my house. They said no one was coming. They hardly saw anyone at all, except the postman. I looked at the cameras at the nearest intersection. I stood at a pole for about 10 minutes, but noticed that one of them had not been working for a long time. The lens was cracked. The streets were too empty to rely on a bystander. For a few days, I lived on the machine. I got up, went to work, and returned home. I didn't really talk to anyone. I felt like someone was holding me at gunpoint. Surveillance. Expectation. Every sound in the house seemed deliberate. Every rustle outside the window is significant. I was sleeping with the lamp on, and I started putting a match in the crack of the front door to check whether someone had opened it or not. Twice in the morning, I found a match on the floor. Twice, but not a single sound at night. No creaking, no popping, nothing. On the 5th day after that note, I couldn't stand it and left. I just packed my bag, put on my jacket, and went to a motel outside the city. I didn't tell anyone. I turned off my phone so they wouldn't track me. The motel was old, with a peeling sign, but with a proper lock and thick curtains. I rented a room that smelled of dust and chemicals from a cheap air freshener. He closed the door, slid the bolt, sat down on the bed, and for the first time in a long time felt at least some kind of illusion of safety. But it only lasted one night. The next morning, I went down to the reception to get a coffee from a vending machine when the receptionist, an elderly man in a stretched sweater, said, "Your friend left a letter for you." I froze. What friend? He's so tall, in a raincoat. He knew exactly which room you were in. He said, "Tell Ethan, he'll understand." And he left. He handed me a white envelope with a handwritten inscription, "Don't be afraid to remember." There was one phrase inside. You saw him die, but you were told to forget. My heart started pounding. His hands were shaking. I stared at those words as if they could answer something. I didn't understand myself. Who died? What did I forget? I didn't understand what they were talking about, but it felt like someone had twisted my inner world and was now slowly putting it back together, but in a different order. I spent the whole day trying to remember. Something from childhood, school years, maybe someone from the yard died. I remembered seeing an ambulance at one of the houses when I was a teenager, but it was an elderly neighbor who had a heart attack. No drama. There was nothing in my head that would match such a note. I started going through the old photos that were stored on my old laptop. School albums, pictures with friends. Everything seemed normal, familiar, until I came across one picture taken near an old lake. I was there, and there was a boy I didn't remember at all. At all. No face, no name. On the back of the picture was written, Lake. With E. With E. Who is it? I showed the photo to my mom the next day. I came back under the pretext of missing you. We were drinking tea, sitting in an old kitchen chair, and I asked her directly, "Mom, who is this in the photo?" "I understand. And this one?" She stopped talking. She looked at me a little longer than necessary and said, "This is Evan. You were friends with him when you were little. We were very friendly. He lived next door, then they moved in or not." She hesitated. I don't remember exactly what happened to him. I've seen her lie. Not out of spite, but rather out of old habit. Adults often do this when they don't want their children to know something difficult. But now I wasn't a child. I insisted and asked again. Then Mom, after a short silence, said, "Something bad happened to him." It was just the two of you. It was summer. I do not know all the details. You came home and didn't speak for several days. Then it was like you'd forgotten. We took you to a psychologist. You've been prescribed pills. And then you never thought about it again. Not about him, not about the lake. I sat in complete silence, and a picture slowly formed in my head. Not just surveillance, not just surveillance. Someone new that I had once pushed out of my memory. Someone wanted me to remember that I returned to the house. No one has been there since I moved out. I went in, everything was in its place. But there was a strange presence in the air. I walked around the rooms, opened the doors, turned on the lights. And again, there was a note on the table. You couldn't stop it. But now you don't have to be silent. I shuddered again. I started to remember. Lake, water, a summer day, me standing on the pier and someone nearby. Laughter. Then the noise. Scream. Someone is falling. Water. And I'm standing there not moving. Someone is calling for help. But I'm not moving. Years later, it became just an echo in my head. A blurred spot. But now, someone was giving me every detail back. And he knew more about it than I did. I sat down at the table, put all the notes in front of me, the envelope from motel, the picture. I didn't know who this man was, but he knew my name. He knew where I lived. I knew that I had forgotten. And it seems he was sure that it was time to remember everything. I do not know how he found out, or why you chose it now, but I felt that this was not the end. This is just the beginning, and that someone was there. I always have been I hardly slept that night. I was just sitting on the floor in my living room, leaning against the wall with an open notebook where I wrote down every detail that I remembered. I was trying to sort everything out, who Evan was, what happened at the lake, why I didn't remember anything all these years. But the more I thought about it, the more I felt that someone had already built this route for me. It was as if I was following the footprints that someone had left in advance, knowing exactly when I would stumble upon them. And one morning, when I was already getting used to this feeling, a letter arrived. Present. The post office. No stamp, no sender. Inside was an ordinary paper, yellowish from time to time, folded in half. On it, in a neat, slightly trembling handwriting, was written, "He didn't drown. You just left." I was sitting with this letter in the kitchen, leaning over the table, and I could feel my hands shaking. I remembered exactly the water, the splash, the scream, and the silence. And then there's the emptiness. Did I not help? Didn't throw himself into the water? Just left? Why? I found an old folder with newspaper clippings from the days when Grandma collected articles as a keepsake. Among the cooking recipes and gardening tips was a thin, faded clipping. A teenager was found dead on the shore of a lake. The cause of death was drowning. The police consider the accident to be an accident. No name, no photo. Just a small note, but I realized it was him. Evan. And if someone writes to me that he didn't drown, but I left, then there was something more. And if I don't remember, someone remembers it perfectly for me. I went back to that lake. After all these years, it was still there, overgrown with reeds, muddy, surrounded by dead trees. The pier has long since rotted away, leaving only the concrete foundations. I stood by the water, looked at the murky surface, and at some point I seemed to hear inside myself, "You were standing here." Evan was calling, and you watched and didn't say anything. I found an old piece of a broken plaque on the shore. Once there must have been a warning about the depth. A rusty chain, entwined with grass, lay nearby. I squatted down and started shoveling the ground. I don't know why. I just felt that there was something underneath. After a couple minutes, I found a rusty tin compressed into the ground, and inside there was a sheet folded in half. There was a picture on it, me and Evan, but not the one I saw at home. This one was shot from a different angle. It was as if someone was photographing us from behind the bushes. It was handwritten at the bottom. You knew he couldn't swim. My heart sank. I remembered. He asked me not to go too deep. We were arguing. He was on the pier. I was standing in the water. He stumbled and fell. I was just watching, measuring, as if in a stupor. I heard him calling, but I didn't move. Not because he didn't want to help, but because he couldn't. Fear paralyzed me. I just watched as his head disappeared under the water, as he tried to come up, as he waved his arms. And then silence. I went home. I didn't tell anyone, even for myself. It was like my memory had created a new layer that didn't have that. I convinced myself that nothing had happened. But someone knew. Someone was watching. Someone has been living with this truth all this time. And now he wanted me to feel everything he felt. Impotence, guilt, and maybe fear. When I returned home, I discovered that the door was not just closed. The latch, which I always left outside, was latched from inside. I broke it open with a crowbar. Everything was intact inside, but someone had written on the bathroom mirror with their finger, "Now, say it out loud." Tell me what? I stood in front of the mirror. He looked into his own eyes. Long. I saw him drown, I gasped. And I didn't help. Those words seemed to shift something inside. I felt sick. I got down on my knees, and for the first time in all this time, I burst into tears. Not out of fear, out of shame. It wasn't just a memory recall. It was a blow. I relived that day, only now as an adult who understood what my silence meant, and my inaction. A few days have passed. No one else came. There were no notes. The cameras didn't show anything. The mobile phone was silent. I didn't know if this story was over, or if it was just a respite. But there was only one thought in my head. Someone has been waiting all this time for me to name what I was afraid to remember. And now that I've done that, that very man, can finally appear. I didn't know it yet, but I felt there would be a meeting ahead. Real. Personal. The one who started it all, though it's been 3 days since I said that out loud in front of the mirror. The words sounded like a sentence, but there was something else inside them. Liberation. I realized that all this time, I was hiding not from the truth, but from myself. But the realization did not bring peace. It only opened a door that hid other memories. For the first time in a long time, I decided to leave home. Just to walk down the street, get some air, feel like I'm alive, that the world around me still exists. But even in this walk, there was no ordinariness. I began to notice details that had previously escaped me. There was an old newspaper stand on the corner of our block, and it was there that I first heard Evan's name from a stranger. The seller was new, about 40 years old, with a neatly trimmed beard, wearing a shirt 2 sizes too big. When I handed him the money for the bottle of water, he looked at me and said calmly, "You were with him by the lake." Then, I looked up sharply. "With whom?" He smiled a little crookedly. "With the boy who didn't come back." I froze. I didn't know what to say. "Who are you?" He didn't answer. He just turned around and went into the back room. I stood there for a few seconds, then slowly went outside. I felt something swirling around me, invisibly, quietly, but precisely and intentionally. People knew, or at least one of them. I knew a long time ago. I was just starting to remember. When I returned home, I started sorting through things from my childhood. Cardboard boxes, old notebooks, videotapes, even cassettes. I turned on one of the old VHS tapes. It had a birthday record on it. Me and Evan. We were standing by the cake. They were laughing. Someone was filming us, holding the camera at shoulder height. And at some point, she shifted to the side, as if on purpose. A man I didn't recognize appeared in the frame. He stood in the shadow of the house, watching. Even then, even at this moment, I rewound it, stopped, slowed down, increased it. I didn't recognize the face anyway. But there was something familiar about his gaze, not his face, but the way he watched. It was as if he was waiting for me to look in his direction. But I didn't look. I was a kid. I didn't understand anything yet. The landline phone rang from behind. I jumped in surprise. No one used it nowadays. I forgot I had one myself. He picked up the phone. "Admit it to your parents," said the voice. And he quit. I was standing with a pipe in my hand, as if I were holding a grenade. Parents. Those who chose silence from the very beginning. I remembered that day when I returned from the lake, wet, dirty, and wearing a torn t-shirt. My mother just hugged me and said, "You're home, that's the main thing." Not another word. No questions, no interrogations, no attempts to find out what happened. And from that moment on, silence. For years. As if they only cared that I was alive. I called my dad. I asked if he could come by. He arrived in the evening, brought a bag of groceries, as always. I invited him into the kitchen and put the kettle on. They sat in silence. Then I put a picture of the lake in front of him. "Did you know he couldn't swim?" My father looked up. He wasn't surprised. He wasn't tense. He wasn't trying to pretend he didn't understand. He just looked at me with such weariness, as if he had been waiting for this conversation all his life. "We knew," he said. "Your mother found your clothes on the bathroom floor, saw that you were wet. Then the police came. They said they found a body. We decided that you shouldn't remember that. They took you to stay with your grandmother for the whole summer, and then you just didn't talk about him anymore. Why didn't you tell me? Because you woke up screaming every night. And because at some point he stopped. We thought that if you could forget, then it would be better." I listened to him, and each of his answers cut into me like a blade. They knew, and they made the choice for me. They turned me into someone who lives with lies. And now all I felt was not just guilt, but betrayal. I was the one who didn't help, but also the one who was made to forget that I've watched this video dozens of times. Every movement, every oscillation of the camera, every sound of footsteps. At first, I tried to find distortions in the frame, signs of editing, anything to explain what I saw, but was all too true, too real. The terrain, the clothes, the facial expression, everything matched. Even the little things. I wore this jacket 3 days ago. Evan had a small stain of paint on his shirt. He wore it on his last day. I didn't know how that was possible. And it wasn't mysticism, it wasn't otherworldly, it was a cruel, cold-blooded reality. Someone was filming us. Recently, without my knowledge. Someone was nearby, closer than I thought. From that moment on, I didn't sleep anymore. I started reviewing old videos and photos, not to be nostalgic, but to seek them out. Look for inconspicuous figures in the background, silhouettes in reflections, and strange shooting angles. And I started to find it. Everything was in front of my eyes the whole time. I just wasn't looking. The picture from the school fair shows a man in the far corner, half, sideways, wearing a dark baseball cap. The video from the prom shows the same baseball cap, the same pose. In the photo from my sister's wedding, he's back, almost blending into the crowd. He was everywhere, my whole life. And the scariest thing was that he didn't look any older. The pictures were separated by years, but the person in them did not change. Not in the supernatural sense, but in the sense of intent. Someone was following me, since my youth. At first, from afar, then closer and closer. I started to be afraid to go outside, then open the windows. I bought cheap cameras and put them around the apartment. I watched the stairwell, the door, the windows. At night, I listened to sounds, creaks, footsteps from above, the hum of the elevator. I became paranoid, but even in that, there was no escape, because I felt that someone was always one step ahead, and it seemed like I no longer had control over where I ended and where he began. In the evening, 3 days after receiving the video, the doorbell rang. Not a single message, not a single warning, just a knock. Not loud, not nervous, persistent. I went over and looked through the peephole. There was no one on the playground. I opened it, and there was silence. Stairs, railings, everything as always. I took a step forward, and that's when I noticed a white envelope on the doormat. No address, no signature. There's only one piece of paper inside. You knew what you were doing. We both knew, but you stayed. And below is a photo. That's the one. Lake. Water. I'm standing on the shore. Evan is waist deep in the water, holding out his arms to me. And I'm just standing there. No panic. No attempt to help. Just looking. Empty, without emotions. I couldn't deny it anymore. That night, I actually stood and watched. I saw him drown, and he didn't do anything. Not because he was scared. Not because he couldn't swim. But because he didn't want to. We had a fight. I was angry. I wanted him to be scared. I thought he'd get out. I didn't know how quickly it could end. And when I realized it was too late, this photo crushed me. I couldn't pretend anymore. Couldn't live with it. I understood why someone was watching me. Why didn't you let me forget? I was not a victim. I was the reason. That night, I packed up. I left the house for the first time in a long time. I went back to the lake. It's changed, or maybe it hasn't. I just looked at it differently now. It was quiet on the shore. I was standing at the same point where I once stood as a child. And I said out loud everything that needed to be said. No excuses. Without hope of forgiveness. Just the truth. Footsteps sounded behind him. I didn't turn around. I knew who it was. And for the first time, he wasn't afraid. Because everything that was scarier has already happened. I just stood there and waited.